Hello! Have you ever wondered what happened to the generation gap? Does it still exist? Or is it something that we treat a lot differently now than we do today? And how can you use that knowledge? In a moment, we'll be talking to one of the Lightning Bolt 6, and you'll find out all these amazing facts about generations that you may not ever known before. You're listening to the State of Greater Western New York Report, and it's brought to you by...
Each week, our community makes history. Each week, you make history. And each week, there's only one source to turn to for the first take on history. You know what that is? Subscribe to the Sentinel right now to discover the history being made in your own backyard. The Menden Honeoye Falls Lima Sentinel. More than just your news, it's your history. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. Join us each episode as we discuss fantastic topics ranging from history to science to the strange and the wonderful, as well as the treasured spirit with which our region has infused America. We challenge you to consider all things Greater Western New York, from our region's very beginnings to how it inspires, how it empowers, and why it is so admired. Here's the host of the State of Greater Western New York Report, Chris Carosa.
Hello and welcome everyone to this week's version of the State of Greater Western New York Report. I'm Chris Carosa, and we've got a special guest today. His name is Chuck Underwood, and he is one of the original founders of Generation Studies. Generation Studies tells us what's different and the same about the various generations. Years ago, we've had this thing called the generation gap, which explained that there was a difference between generations. But since then, we've discovered that that difference isn't really all that it's made up to sometimes. Sometimes generations tend to repeat themselves. It's interesting. Chuck, you know, you've got a really, really interesting backstory. Before we talk about generations, tell the audience from whence you came, because that's what's really fascinating. What was your first career? How'd you get there? And then how'd you end up studying generations?
Well, hi, Chris, and thank you. And the answer to your question is I previously was a sportscaster, primarily a sports play-by-play announcer for major college football. I started as the so-called voice of the Ohio State Buckeyes on their radio network, and then advanced to Big Ten Conference games of the week in television, and then to ESPN. And that career was thankfully soaring and going great. But then I walked into a restaurant one night and met 9 other people for dinner. We had just met each other recently at a party and decided to get better acquainted. And to make a very, very long story short, in that conversation and sitting at a very large booth, I was struck by that lightning bolt that you mentioned that suggested to me that generation meant something far more important than anyone at that time recognized. And this was in the mid-1980s, about 35 years ago. I couldn't get it out of my head. And so I spent years trying to find information that existed on the generations, and essentially there was none. I learned in the early 90s that a couple of other gentlemen, both on the East Coast, had kind of stumbled upon this same idea when I did. And we slowly connected with a couple of others. And again, to shorten a long story, from the mid-80s to about the year 2000, a 15-year period, we scratched and clawed and researched and put together the foundation of generational study. We didn't know at that time if we had anything. It was a terrifying passage, I think, for all of us. It was for me, because I was devoting so much time to something that did not exist on planet Earth. And I didn't know if I was right or wrong. And then finally, in the year 2002, my telephone rang one day. And it was a call to come into Washington, D.C. and speak about the generations. And with that phone call, for the first time in 15 years, I not only exhaled, I actually came to tears sitting alone in this office, because that was my first indication that I was right and that the others were right. And soon after that first speech in 2002, generational study and America's interest in it, especially by business and by government and by education and even religion. Everybody now wanted to know what this thing was called generational differences and generational dynamics. And so the six of us, who were the Lightning Bolt Six, began living out of airplanes and hotel rooms. We accepted every speech we were offered. Some people said, we can't pay you anything, but we'll cover your travel expenses. And
Right.
we took those.
Yeah, tell us more about this aspect. I'm interested to hear more. How did you really get this out to the masses, and what was some of the reactions from the masses, whether it be high-level individuals, policymakers like that, or just even regular everyday folk? How'd you reach out to them?
Well, regular everyday folk didn't get it at all. I had been hit by this lightning bolt in an innocent conversation at a restaurant, and all I was thinking was generation, generation, generation. And I knew there was something there. I shared it with family. I shared it with friends. I shared it with strangers I might meet. Blank stares from all of them for 15 years. I bounced it. I wasn't thinking about this initially as a business strategy career. I was thinking about it as a daytime television talk show because my background had been television. I had come of age and gone into early adulthood with the legendary Phil Donahue show, which was a serious, topic-oriented daytime talk show that to this day I think is the most important television show in the history of television. And I thought, can America have an intelligent, hour-long, weekday conversation about these generational differences and dynamics that penetrate every corner of our life? So I scratched up some money. I produced a pilot show. I went out to Hollywood and I pitched this idea to the Hollywood folks. I went to New York, where there also were significant television people, and I said, here's the idea. And what they told me, I was out at the film lot at Columbia Pictures in Hollywood, and the guy told me this, and this is the early 90s. He said, I love your idea. And he said, but the daytime television viewer has changed from the Phil Donahue days, because Phil Donahue did a wonderful job of empowering women just as the women's movement was coming up. And between the women's movement and Phil Donahue, most of the women who had been sitting at home looking for anything to exercise their brains are now in the workplace. And what's left is largely, not exclusively, but largely a lower income, lesser educated woman who would rather see somebody on television whose lives are worse than hers. And that's why you're seeing in the early 90s shows like Jerry Springer and all of the other shows that Springer bore. And we all know what that category is. It's called sleaze TV. And that was taking over daytime television. So my TV idea died as I was thinking of it. And I then had to think, what can I do with this topic? And that's when the phone rang in the early 2000s. Can you come into Washington and speak about the generations? And it then, from that point forward, became, for me, a speaking topic, a training topic to business, government, education, and religion. And then finally, after about 8 years of that, I was ready to take it back to national television. And so on PBS, I produced the world's first series on national television that explains the story of each American generation. And that's how I ended up getting it to TV. That's the short version of the story, believe it or not.
And you see a copy of the book up there that you came out with, America's Generations. More on that a little bit in a moment. I will add, though, that I actually met Jerry Springer at the National Society of Newspaper Columnists us a meeting a couple of years ago, and he tells the same sort of story that you told about how the movie producers really wanted to go that route. In fact, he says he wanted to be the next Oprah, which was a higher level kind of sort of show, but the producers really wanted him to go with this kind of chair banging type of show. He's not that kind of person at all. I mean, you don't know that. If you talk to him, he's a very smart guy, and he was just playing a part. So that's what happens when you're on TV. I guess you're forced to play a little part. And you know, that's kind of interesting, though. I'm thinking about this. To what extent might that be generational? Do you think that maybe it's not just economic demographics, but is there a generational aspect of this? For example, did that same audience exist in the 60s, in the 40s, in the 20s that wanted to see people banging chairs on themselves? Or maybe did they want to see a more uplifting example? Not somebody worse than them that they could look down on, but maybe somebody that they could look up to. We're getting ahead of ourselves. This is for the second segment, but it's relevant right now. I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the Jerry Springer shows, and by the way, I worked in the development of my talk show idea with both of Jerry Springer's bosses. And they were brilliant television men, and they were the ones who started Jerry Springer straight. He tried a normal daytime talk show, and it was failing. And that's when they went to the sleaze talk idea. And there were then so many dozens and dozens of knockoff shows just like that. But through the generations, in terms of television, and this is the damnation of television, what you're about to hear. Television gets viewers. These days, ever since cable arrived in roughly 1980, when there were so many channels for us to choose from, television from 1980 forward to today had to get viewers by shocking us with sex, shocking us with vulgarity, shocking us with nudity, or as close as they can get. In the 1980s, when that all began and producers were desperate for viewers and desperate for ratings, violence escalated so rapidly that there was a national group of mothers who formed and pressured television to reduce the violence because of what they saw it was doing to their kids who watched the violence. So cable television really took television quality from what it had been straight down. Prior to that, with only 3 channels, an ABC, a CBS, and an NBC, and a little bit later then public television came along, most of the television was very, very life-reinforcing. It was very positive. It was very clean. And Donahue began his show in the midst of that, and he ended his show right around, I think it was 1990, after beginning in the mid-60s. He ended that when cable television had now reduced daytime viewing to what we see today. But the Jerry Springer show and that genre kind of replaced the soap opera. Soap operas were kind of growing tired, and it was, again, viewers seeing rich people and beautiful people who had it worse than they did. That was the formula for the soaps. But when soaps finally started to wear out and television said, what can we do? The answer was shock, talk television like Springer.
Right. So we've eaten into a lot of this is supposed to be going into the second segment. There's a question I got from the audience too. I'm going to hold that back till the break. We got about a minute or so left. So Chuck, I'm going to ask you to tell us very quickly so that we could use this as a launching point for the second segment. What are the generations? You know, what's the foundations that you use in terms of defining how you look at the generations? If you can really quickly go over that'll help us out, keep us on time.
Yeah, and do you have a slide on that you can show? Yeah, these are the four principles that represent the foundation of generational study. First of all, between birth and the time we leave the full-time classroom years, and especially high school, but to a certain extent college, we are going to mold most of the core values that we will keep for life. And those values are pounded into us by parents and educators and faith-based leaders. There are, given point number one, 6 current living generations, which we'll explain later. We know now that the core values that are burned into us in our formative years guide our minute-by-minute decision-making for life. And K through 12, kindergarten through 12th grade, we don't join a generation then. Those are our pre-generation years when we are in the process of forming. And it's when we finally leave high school and roughly get into our 20s that we now possess a set of core values that are going to be with us by and large for life, and that will exert phenomenal influence on the decision making that we make.
Excellent. So we'll get more into that in a second. You're listening to the State of Greater Western New York Report. I'm Chris Carosa with Chuck Underwood, and we will be back in a second.
Through the mists of time, nature and man have both created and buried treasures beyond the imagination. With the ages, these riches slowly dissolve into mere myths until they are forever forgotten. But there are those brave souls who tirelessly cling to the truth, ever seeking to discover the undiscovered, to reveal what has always been there, to uncover the hidden gems of a land thought forsaken but loved by millions. 50 Hidden Gems of Greater Western New York. Discover the secrets in your own backyard. Buy your copy now at 50hiddengems.com.
Welcome back, everybody, to the State of Greater Western New York Report. Today we're talking with Chuck Underwood, who was one of the 6 lightning bolts, the original founders of generational studies. He's going to tell us all about the generations. And right off the bat, we've got a question from the audience that asks, what are the generations? I mean, you hear all these things in headlines and everything about different generations. Is this really supported by the academic research? So, Chuck, you want to try to take a stab at that? I know you have a slide here that you want to show so we can get it up there. Tell us a little bit about the generations.
Sure. Well, first of all, one generation ends and the next begins whenever the times in America and the teachings in America change in a significant and widespread way. So, the GI generation was born between 1901 and 1926, which means in this year of 2021, they are aged 95 and older. This is the immortalized greatest generation. They saved the world in World War II and then came home, built the greatest nation in the history of the planet, and led that nation in the 1950s, 60s, and into the early 80s. Oh, how we miss the GI generation and thank those who are still with us. The silent generation had to try to follow that act. They were born from 1927 to 1945, current age this year, 76 to 94. The silents proved to be brilliant in the so-called helping professions. They gave us great educators, religious leaders, architects, engineers, accountants, attorneys. That was their brilliance. Leadership was not their brilliance because they just happened to be born right beneath a great leadership generation, the GIs. So when the silents took their turn at the top of America in the 1990s and 2000s, our nation began to struggle from poor leadership. The baby boomers, born from 1946 to 1964, current age 57 to 75. The boomers are now about halfway through their leadership of America. They will continue to impart their values at the top of our nation through the 2020s, and they are trying to clean up the mess that was handed to them in leadership, especially in government, and especially by the older silent generation. Generation X, a misunderstood generation born from 1965 to 1981. Xers this year have cleared their 30s. They are now 40 to 56. They are a generation that is proving to be brilliant in entrepreneurialism, in idea generation. That is their strength. The Millennials, born from 1982 through, at the moment, 2001, which means their ages at the moment are about 23 to 39. This is America's first full-blown tech generation. And what we now understand is that tech has damaged the millennials as much as it has helped them. But they are an optimistic generation when they take their turn at the top of America because of what happened to them in their formative years. They are probably going to be an excellent leadership generation in the 2050s and 60s. Gen X will lead in the 2030s and 2040s. And finally, Generation Z, the stupidest name in the history of generational naming, and I had nothing to do with it. Born from, we think, about 2002 until we don't know when their generation will end. At the moment, they are roughly about age 19 to 22. Again, we don't join a generation until we clear high school, which is essentially at age 18. So we're still learning not only what the core values of Generation Z are, but we are also getting a better fix on exactly the birth year when the millennials stopped and Gen Z began. And those are our current living generations.
Why don't we call them Generation Zoomer or the Zoomer generation? Because that's probably going to have a profound impact on their lives the last couple of years.
The naming, Chris, of generations has always been a little bit fickle, but here's where Generation Z came from, and this is 100% dumbness. It was based on a rumor, an inaccurate rumor, that there had been in America a Generation Y. There was never a legitimate Generation Y. Generation Y is a name that the auto industry in Detroit gave initially to what in legitimate generational study would eventually become our very youngest Gen Xers. And what happened back then, the auto industry found that in the 1990s, kids graduating from high school, instead of buying a used car, like everybody had previously done at that age, instead, their moms and dads were helping them to purchase new automobiles. And so the car industry said there's a market to sell to 16 to 20-year-olds. Let's give them a name so we can talk about them. We're hearing this generational study thing beginning to emerge, and we know there's a Gen X. So the auto industry, we're going to call this tiny little demographic, a 4-year demographic, Gen Y. They were never a generation. They were an auto industry buzzword. Well, then when our next generation came along and so much misinformation began, and the misinformation about Generation Z is terrifying, somebody, probably one of your colleagues as a newspaper reporter, decided to use the term Gen Z, and it caught on. The name's unimportant. What counts is their birth years and their core values. Core values are everything in the legitimate study of generations.
Well, when it comes to names, I'll tell you, Gen X really doesn't hit it. For that sounds like a lazy name. You know, just to pick up a variable when they could have called them birth dearthers or, you know, the Apollo generation. Who knows? Whatever. But
well,
let's go ahead.
when I speak, I explain to Gen Xers how they got their name because many think it's an insult. But it really began with a Canadian author who wrote a book called Gen X. It was fiction. But in it, he described this generation of North Americans, both United States and Canadian citizens, these young people coming of age who didn't like the fact that marketers were trying to pigeonhole them into a single demographic. These kids were coming up uncommonly independent thinking. They didn't like the idea of being part of a larger group. So whenever somebody tried to give them a name, in their heads, this demographic went like this: X. Don't call us this.
So then it does make sense, in a sense, for X where you exit out.
And about the time that Bill Strauss and Neil Howe were writing the first legitimate book about the generations in 1990, there also was a movie came out about Malcolm X. And that movie about Malcolm X was heavily merchandised. T-shirts with X's, ball caps with X's. And there also was a Canadian punk rock band that called itself Generation X. So those names were coming together from these disparate corners of the universe, and Strauss and Howe formalized it in the important foundational book about the history of America's generations, and so it stuck.
Wow. So you learn something new every day. I certainly didn't know that. That was great. We don't have a whole lot of time left, just a few more minutes, but I did want to get into some of the meat, the practical side of what your studies in generations offers. And let's talk about it I'm going to give you an example, and I know we didn't rehearse this, so if it catches you off guard, you can say that. Community building. So I bring that up because what are we? We are Greater Western New York. We are a community. How do the different generations treat community and building, civic involvement, that sort of thing? What if we're talking to someone of a boomer, say, how is it different than talking to a Gen Xer or a millennial?
And it's very different. And I train chambers of commerce. I trained the state of New Jersey, which was losing a lot of millennials. They would go to colleges in New Jersey and then go elsewhere for their careers and their lives. And in Sarasota, Florida, they have what's called a reinvention convention. And they want to have in their community a high quality of life for every generation. And so they brought me in to teach them how to do that. They're doing brilliantly on their own, but it appears I added some layers that they didn't think about. But the answer to your question is, if it's serious community building, if your local businesses and say your Western New York region, your business, your government, your citizens, your religions, if they really want to build a community, they need training in generational community strategies. And that training involves what does each generation want in their community, in their region, in terms of an educational mix, not just for 18-year-olds, but for 68 and 88-year-olds. What do they want in recreation? What do they want in terms of faith-based offerings? What do they want from their government? And each generation has different needs. Baby boomers and silents might use the bike path for bicycles, and Xers and millennials might want to run that path. So it's not an easy answer. It is a sophisticated business strategy training program that helps any geographic entity, a region, a single community, or something larger than that, to appeal to all generations.
Right. I want to say that, if you're really interested in learning more, here's the book. It's kind of thick. Look how thick it is. Wow. And Chuck really gives a lot of examples of what he means and what he's talking about in that book. And obviously it changes over time. So to to be frank. And I did meet Chuck initially through a convention, through a newspaper convention, where he talked to the audience for about 90 minutes, and he gave a lot of really great examples. And if you're not fortunate enough to go to one of those sorts of events, definitely you could look in the book. He's got a good series there in the book about the different generations. So Chuck, I want to thank you for being on today. I want to thank the audience for watching and for providing the questions. If you want to provide a question, then simply go to stateof.greaterwesternnewyork.com and you'll be able to sign up and get an invitation to this private audience that appears every Thursday at noon. Otherwise, you can watch a rebroadcast of it 1:30 on Sunday on our YouTube and Facebook channels. So for now, Chuck, thank you very much. Everybody out there in TV land, or whatever we call this land, I guess it's a generational thing, Chuck. We'll see you next week. All right, bye-bye for now.